Y'all have reading materials? Alright. Alright, friends, I'm gonna go ahead and get us started. Just clarifying, there's been 2 handouts passed out, and if you didn't grab one, they're in the back. And then I think I've gotten it to everyone, but does everyone have a reading schedule? They gave them out last week, so you would have gotten it then, but if you didn't come last week. It's this one. I think I just gave it to you.
You got it. I got it.
Yeah. So I think we're good. All right, let me open us in prayer. Gracious, holy, loving God, we give you thanks for this church and this community you have drawn us into. Let your Holy Spirit be with us now as we discuss what your Bible is, what it means to us, and what it calls us to. We ask this all in your holy name. Amen. Amen. Okay, so we are in our summer book study, and I think most of y'all were here last week. I was out of town, but we're digging in now to chapters 2 and 3. So I've got a handout with just some quotes I've pulled, and then I also have the second handout. I like charts and stuff, and so I thought this might be helpful, especially as a way to compare the different Bibles. So we'll look into that. And then there's an update on the scholarship that Pelikan's book misses out on. And so that's why I have some notes here about the canon, but we'll address that when we get to it. I love to be interrupted, so for y'all that haven't been in a class of mine before, just interrupt at will. I love questions, and so just ask them when you have them. You interrupt Will at will. That's right. Easier to remember. IWW. Okay, so let's dig in, and we start from that kind of first introductory chapter, and now we move into the actual text of the Bible, and we start with what's known as the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians call the Old Testament. So I'm going to look at some of these quotes. I'm not going to read from all of them, but let's start with that top one on page 29 on the handout. Yeah, sorry. Rather, the Bible consistently directs our attention away from cosmogony, be it mythological or scientific, to the special relation between God and the human race. He doesn't stay on this point much, but I think this is probably one of the most important points for us to remember. The Bible is not written as a scientific document. It's not written as a cosmological document. It's not even written as a historical document. It is a document that is containing the relationship of God with humanity, first through the people of Israel, and then as we come into the New Testament, through all peoples through the person of Jesus Christ. But that's a really, really important point. Lane?
Would this interfere with Richard Rohr's cosmic Christ that he talks about? I wonder.
I mean, I couldn't speak to that explicitly. I think the point he's trying to make here is that when a lot of attempts to defend the Bible wrestle around trying to prove its historical credibility or its scientific credibility. And what he's saying is that's not the Bible's point or purpose. The Bible's point and purpose is to talk about God's relationship with humanity. Now, there's history in the Bible and there's cosmology in the Bible, but that's not the kind of primary aim. And what you're talking about, I think would be separate. That's like the cosmic role of Christ and like Colossians or Ephesians, that kind of the salvific work of Christ extends to all people. That's within the realm of God's relationship with humanity or the cosmos. So Bob, would you read page 30?
The title of this chapter, The Truth in Hebrews, is a translation of the Latin Hebraica Veritas, the title that Jerome, 4th century Christian translator of the Bible into Latin, used for the Tanakh, which makes up at least 3/4 of the Christian Bible. Traditionally, it has been divided into 3 parts. Torah, the 5 books of Moses or Pentateuch, Navi, the prophets, and Ketuvim, The writings are hagiographa. The Apocrypha, though a product of Judaism, are not part of the Jewish canon of the Bible, but they are included in the Christian canon of the Old Testament for the Roman Catholic and Orthodox churches. The Torah, the Pentateuch, together with the book of Joshua, can be seen as the account of how Israel came into being as a nation and how it possessed the promised land. Nevi'im, the prophets, continue the story of Israel in the promised land, describing the establishment and development of the monarchy and presenting the messages of the prophets to the people. Ketuvim, the writings, or hagiographa, include speculation on the place of evil, death, and the scheme of things, Job and Ecclesiastes. The poetical works, Psalms above all, and some additional historical books.
So that's basically a summation of this, the majority of this chapter. And so when we talk about the Hebrew Bible, it's separated into these three parts: the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. And if you look on the one-page handout I gave you, this is a really good thing to just hold on to as a way to kind of refer to this. So if you look at the page, not the chart, but the other page, I show here the Jewish Bible, Protestant Bible, Roman Catholic, Orthodox, and Apocrypha. Now, if you flip over, you can see how those line up with each other. So the book will get into all of this, but for today.
You're going for the thing.
Right.
Sorry.
Have a robot on me.
You're going farther away.
What does hagiographa mean?
It's like hagiography,
Saints?
yeah, it's like holy writing or kind of like saintly writing, yeah. And then, Ketuvim spelled with an H sometimes, but not. So this is, today what we're gonna deal with is the Hebrew Bible. We will talk about the Christian Old Testament later, but I want you to hold on to this because as you see, our Old Testament is different from Roman Catholic and Orthodox Old Testament. We will talk about that at another time, but I want you to hold on to this because it's a really good chart to have handy. But today, you can think about this as the law, the prophets, and the writings. And we're going to dig into what each of these mean and do. But this is how the Old Testament is structured. The Tanakh, right? The Hebrew Bible. Take a look just on this page at the furthest column, the Hebrew Bible and the Protestant canon. They are the exact same books, but in a completely different order. Do you see that?
Uh-huh.
So the Pentateuch is the same, and then the history is roughly the same, but then it starts to kind of fall apart, and you'll see there's a different order.
There's an appendix in the book
Yeah,
that compares the order.
yeah. So we'll get into why all this happens later, but the point being is our Protestant Old Testament is the exact same as the Jewish Bible, except for the order and what else? There's one other distinction. The number of books. So if you look back on the other page, there's 24 books in the Jewish Bible and there's 39 in the Protestant Old Testament. But wait, they're all the same book, so how does that happen?
The minor prophets, well.
Okay, so the minor prophets are considered a singular book, and then Kings, Chronicles, and Samuel are not broken up into books 1 and 2. The reason they're broken up into 1 and 2 is because they're long and they ran out of scrolling. That's literally why they're called 1 and 2. They're considered a singular book, but because of the ways that books used to be scrolls, the spacing was different.
And Ezra and Nehemiah are one book in the Tanakh. Right?
Yeah. So what we have here is something very similar to us, and yet something very distinct from us. And so it's really important to know why these books, these are similar and different, okay? But this is something that this entire book is just gonna revolve around over and over again, is how, the Jewish Bible precedes the Old Testament, how that breaks up into what's later called the Apocrypha, and then how do the Protestants rearrange the ordering, all that stuff we'll get into, but just keep a hold of this as we keep going. So, continuing, on the handout with the, book stuff. Even with all of this, however, most assignments of occurrences in the Tanakh to corresponding dates in the Egyptian, Babylonian, Persian, Syrian, and Greek calendars are arbitrary and hypothetical. Many such attempts, indeed, are theologically tendentious and are intended to prove or disprove a point about the inerrancy or authority of the Bible. Always a dangerous procedure because the supposedly assured results of archaeology can be as unstable as the shifting sands where the archaeologists have dug. This leads to a fundamental conclusion about these materials. They are intended not primarily as a chronicle, but as a testimony of faith and the one who identified himself to Moses from the burning bush as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, the God of the everlasting covenant. So we're going to dig into all of these books, but Pelikan's reminding us as we do that, this is not a scientific document. This is not a historical document. He's calling it a document that contains the special relationship of God with humanity, or this language of testimony. And the Old Testament scholar who just passed, Walter Brueggemann, he used a word I really like, which is proclamation. He said the scriptures are, their central aim is proclamation. They are proclaiming something about God and God's relationship with humanity. That's not to say that there's not history in them, but that's not the goal or the aim, right? They weren't sitting down to say, hey, we're going to write a historical document. The concept of history is a relatively modern concept. So when we're reading through these, when we talk about these, we need to remind ourselves over and over again, this is about God's relationship with humanity. That's what these are driving at overall. Okay, so now we dig into these three sections. We'll start with the Torah. And the Torah, which can mean law or instruction, or Pentateuch, which obviously just means 5, the Bible presents the record of the divine action and legislation underlying its entire subsequent account. With the completion of the events related in the Torah, the people of Israel have finished its captivity in Egypt and its wanderings, and was ready to enter the promised land. Thus the Torah, in a very real sense, is the book of Israel's beginnings. So when we're talking about Torah, there's kind of 3 things to remember. The beginnings, God entering into relationship with humanity, and the giving of the law, which is related to covenant, right? Those are what this book is dealing with as a whole. And I haven't, I just listed where he mentions the individual books, but we have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Let me stop there and see what questions or thoughts did y'all have about what he said about those 5 books?
I don't necessarily understand why Deuteronomy is ascribed to be the book Moses wrote.
Yeah, that's more of a tradition than like a fact. I mean, Moses dies in Deuteronomy.
Where did the material in Deuteronomy that is not in Exodus come from?
Who knows? I can't speak to the specifics around that, other than that a lot of the what are called the Deuteronomistic texts, the texts that come out of Deuteronomy. So basically everything after Deuteronomy are very influenced by Deuteronomy. And so there's a group of Jews that are writing all of this, and a large portion of these writings happened during the Babylonian captivity. So these stories have been around for a long time, right? But they're an oral culture. And so they're telling these stories to themselves over and over again, and they're an integral part of who they are, their identity, their religion, etc. And then the Babylonians come in and they start slowly over time seizing Jerusalem, and eventually they destroy Jerusalem and the temple. And then when that happens, the elites get pulled in, or basically get pulled out of Jerusalem and taken to Babylon. And that point is when these texts start to turn into actual physical writings. Most of them, not all of them. There are books that precede that. Amos is a really good example. Amos was probably written in real time in around 800, before the siege of Israel by Assyria, which happened in 722. But the point being is that these texts are a living part of their culture, which is really hard for us to imagine. And they transition into writing around that period. As they're doing that, there's certain aims and beliefs and ways of interpreting their tradition. And so a lot of the Deuteronomistic texts are interpreting their tradition through that lens. A great example is Deuteronomy 30, where it talks about blessing and curse. If you follow me, there will be blessings. If you go against me, there will be curses. And what just happened? Jerusalem was completely destroyed, right? And so a lot of this tradition is preceding it, but it's also interpreting it through the lens of that event.
Isn't a lot of Deuteronomy cast as a final speech or address of Moses?
Yes, it's Moses giving a talk to the Israelites that are going to go into the promised land. A lot of them don't go into the promised land because I almost said a bad word. They whined in the desert, right? The 40 years. Egypt was so much better than this. This is awful. And God's like, oh, this is awful. Well, you're not going to get to go to the promised land now. And Moses is one of those. And so Moses gets to see the promised land. Remember, this is what Martin Luther King refers to. I've been to the mountaintop, but I might not get there with you. That's from Moses. Moses sees the promised land, but doesn't get to go there. And so Moses is giving them a law. And we have to remember, we think of law as like this thing that is like punitive or like keeps us in line because we're bad people. The law is a way of living. I really think that's important. There is a covenant relationship between humanity and God, and the form that takes is the covenant, right? We think about all this stuff like don't do this, don't do that, but there's lots of stuff about take care of each other and love each other and let people that don't have stuff that you have in excess, right? And so that's what Moses is giving to them.
But having it cast as a farewell address strikes me as being very literary, sort of a the literary imagination of the people that have the book of Deuteronomy arose.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with that. Yeah, I mean, when we read the Bible, this isn't something like God's whispering into someone's ear and it just pops up, right? This is a people relating to God over time, interpreting that, understanding that, sharing that story, and that story slowly over time becoming what we call the Bible. And to say it's not literary is to diminish just the beauty and the thought that has gone into it. I completely would say that these are inspired texts, but they're also human texts. They're also literary texts. So, okay, so we're going along a timeline, right? This is a really helpful way to think about the Old Testament. So at the very end of Genesis, right, what happens? Who's at the end of Genesis? Starts with a J. Joseph. Where does Joseph go? Right. And then Egypt happens, and then what? Right. So we leave, right? Exodus. And then we have like Leviticus, and then Numbers, and then Deuteronomy brings us to the precipice of the promised land. So that's the Torah, right? So the Torah is very much about how did Israel become a nation, but it's not a nation in the way we think of it yet. It's a nation that's bonded to God through covenant, okay? Not through an attachment to a land or anything. And Exodus is a story of them being freed from the oppression of Egypt, right? So this is the Catholic theologian Hans Urban Balthasar said the Bible starts in Exodus. Genesis is just a prelude because he sees the relationship God has with Israel as distinct from all other nations at that point in time. And Exodus is the place where that really comes to play because this is where God is the liberator and also the one that is leading them to something new. And Leviticus is very much a legal document. Numbers has legal stuff, but it's also just kind of an accounting of what's going on as they're traveling. And who's there and how many people are there and all the different tribes and what they have. And then we go to Deuteronomy, and that's essentially the giving of the law again. So we have a lot of prescriptive stuff in there, but it's also the kind of story of how they come to the precipice of entering in the promised land. And what's next?
Joshua.
Right. So do you see what's going on here? We're walking through the Bible, but we're also walking through history. There's a chronology that doesn't play out completely with the Hebrew Bible, but it does in a large way. So next we come to the Nevi'im. Joanna, would you read that page 36 quote?
Under this title, the Jewish scriptures include a collection of 8 books, according to the Jewish reckoning. These 8 books are listed separately in Christian Bibles and come to a total of 21. The collection contains the books that have traditionally been ascribed to the prophets, and in addition, several more historical books that provide the background and setting for the books of the prophets.
Great. So, well, yeah, why don't you just jump over that middle part? Because that's just the listing where he talks about the books, and read that page 41.
Thus, Nevi'im, the books of the prophets, both major and minor, form a contemporary on the history of Judah and of Israel. They interpret this history as a sign of God's judgment and of God's mercy, and they call the nation back to repentance and faithfulness. Their role in the total corpus of the literature of the Tanakh is therefore a very important one, budding on the foundational narratives and the legislation of the Torah.
Great. So again, if you flip over on this and look at the chart, this is where things start to veer from how our Old Testament is arranged. And so when we get into the Nevi'im, the prophets, what's happening here is these are books that we could say largely fall into the genre of prophetic or historical. Now that's not exhaustive, right? There's going to be some historic and prophetic books in the Ketuvim, but by and large, the majority of what we would call the prophetic text happen. So they enter the promised land, and there's Joshua, right? The conquest. And then there's this kind of, there's various ways to talk about it, but there's kind of like a tribal confederacy, okay? There's all these tribes, and they're loosely affiliated by their identity as Hebrews or Israelites, okay? But they largely kind of keep to their own areas and their own tribes. This is what book?
Judges.
Judges. Okay, so again, Israel's relationship, the kind of cohesiveness of it is its identity as a covenant people, okay? And they're kind of slowly becoming what we would call a nation state, but they're not there yet. Okay, and so these judges rule them and oversee them and kind of keep the order. But if you've read Judges, it's kind of like the Wild West. It's a very fun, wild book to read. Okay, so who's kind of considered the last judge?
Samuel.
Yes, Samuel. Okay, so Samuel is kind of the person that's on the precipice of the tribal confederacy to the nation. I'm just gonna write nation state, because I think it's a good way to talk about it, but remember, it's a monarchy, okay? But it's becoming a state in the way that we would talk about states, right? A centralized power, an economy, clearly demarcated territory, all of those kind of things are happening, and not just this kind of loose group of folks living out in some loose affiliation. So Samuel is the transition into the monarchy, and who comes as the first king? Right? And then who's the other king that's listed in Samuel?
David.
Okay, so we have Samuel and Samuel, obviously, but we also have Saul and David. Great, and then next comes the book of
King.
Yes, so Kings comes after Samuel. And what happens in Kings is David dies, right? And the power transfers to Solomon. And then after Solomon, what happens?
Made the northern kingdom.
Yes, there's a guy named Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Jeroboam, I think I'm getting this right, is in the southern kingdom, Judah, and Rehoboam is in the northern kingdom, Israel, okay? So what happens is there's a split and the northern kingdom is called Israel, and this can be confusing, right? Because they're all Israelites. But just think about it as the north. And then there's the southern kingdom, which is referred to as Judah, because it's predominantly that tribe. Okay, so Jerusalem is here, and like Samaria, Bethlehem are up here. Okay, if you look at a map, Israel's like, if you looked at like historical Israel, it would be, you know, Israel up here, and then when you get down to around Jerusalem, that's where the southern kingdom is.
For Shallow and Session North,
Yes, I think.
that was one of the holy places.
So, what happens in Kings is largely mayhem. Okay, but mayhem not through the people, but it's kind of put on the shoulders of the king at the time. There are good kings throughout, but they're by and large very bad people, and they're very bad because they go against what God wants, right? And so again, this all starts back to here. God is in relationship with humanity through covenant, and part of the covenant is staying within the bounds of what the covenant calls us to. That's not only vertical, our relationship with God, but horizontal, our relationship with each other. So what happens when there's bad kings?
Bad things happen historically.
Well, that's very true, but prophets rise up, okay? So there's been prophets, I mean, Samuel's considered a prophet. There's prophets, and judges. But what we're seeing is the kings are being bad, and all of a sudden, prophets come. Okay, so we get to the prophet, here, let me, go. So what's happening is the kings are getting bad, and this is when the history gets really jumbled, and for the sake of this class, I'm gonna skip over a lot of it, but just for the sake of it, Israel is destroyed in 722 by the Assyrians. The Assyrians keep trying to get into Judah, but they're not successful, and it's not until 587, this is all BC obviously, that the Babylonians come in and destroy Judah. So that's what Kings is talking about, okay? And concurrent with that, we have Assyrian and then Babylonian. And underneath all of this, we have the prophets, okay? So a lot of the major and minor prophets are yelling at the kings and the people of Israel and Judah, saying you are disobeying God and bad things are headed your way. And then obviously bad things head your way. Assyria destroys Israel, Babylon destroys Judah. And so that happens, and then what the prophets do is they kind of lament, right? They say this is terrible, we've deserved this, we've gone away from God, and these ills have fallen upon us. And then they turn and they start to say, but God has not left us, right? This is what we see in parts of Jeremiah, and Isaiah and other books, Ezekiel. God is going to do something new here, right? God is going to revive us. God is going to renew us. And so the prophets are stretching through the highs and lows, and also this kind of future oriented hope. And so what we have in the prophets are the major and minor. And this is simply related to the length of the book. That's it, not to the importance of their message, but the length. So major would be Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And then the minor are the 12 prophets that start with Hosea and end with Malachi. And all of this.
Former prophets, or Joshua, Judges, Ruth.
Yeah, that's another way they would refer to all these historical books is former prophets. But for the sake of what we're talking about today, that these are all just under the Nevi'im, which are prophetic texts. So we've gone through 2/3 of the Hebrew Bible, and you see it's almost all following a historical axis. Now, the prophets are all over the place as far as their timeline, but they largely fit within this bracket, which overlaps with Kings. Okay, so Kelly,
Yes,
would you read those first two quotes under Ketuvim?
yes.
The division of the Tanakh comprises a miscellaneous collection of sacred writings, often identified by their Greek name Hagiographa, or sacred writings, that cannot be classified in either the Torah or the Nevi'im. Psalms, Proverbs, and Job constitute the principal poetic literature of the Tanakh. Although there are poetic sections in other books as well, even in some of the more prosaic historical books.
Thanks. So it's really important to note that these are considered the primary poetic text of the Hebrew Bible, but the Hebrew Bible is estimated to be between 60 and 75% poetry in whole. If you ever have a Bible that breaks it up by verse, it's just flip through your Old Testament. A lot of it'll just write it like prose, right? It'll just be block text, but a lot of translations will keep the original lineation, and so you'll see it like it's written like a poem. The Bible, huge parts of the Old Testament are poetry. It's an essential part of communication in that text. But the primary text are Psalms, Proverbs, and Job. Now, Proverbs can largely be put here, largely dealing with kind of like courtly manners. Psalms, I think you could just put Psalms here, but it goes all over the place, right? They were continued to be written after they were started. And Job, based off of the Hebrew, probably is back in here. Okay, maybe it's hard to date Job, but we're just gonna put Job here. Job is an older text. If you read through it, there's not a lot of the markers of the covenant and that kind of relationship that would identify Israel. And the language itself is very old. So, did I hear a question? Nope. Okay. And then after that, we have what are called the megaloth or the rolls. And this is kind of a loose group of things. So we have Song of Songs, which is attributed to who? So he probably didn't write it, but we'll put it here. Song of Songs. What else did Solomon write?
Proper.
Well, that's another traditional one, but I was going for Ecclesiastes. Okay, so where I'm writing these does not mean they were written at that time, but their content is coming around that time. Does that make sense? Okay, and then we have so Song of Songs, and then Ruth was like probably in here, right? And then Esther comes over here because it's after Babylon, and she's under what rule? What court is Esther in? Persian. Yeah, so yeah, there's different Persian people, but yeah, after Babylon, remember Cyrus comes in and destroys Babylon and sends the Jews back to the homeland. Not all of them, but most of them.
Jewish hero.
Yeah, and that's how the Jewish Bible ends, with Cyrus sending them back to the homeland. Okay, and then so Lamentations. So Lamentations is right here because it's mourning the destruction of Babylon. Lamentations is traditionally ascribed to Jeremiah, though most people think it was someone else. And I've done Ecclesiastes. So we've got all the roles. Okay, so you see here. We're able, if we know the history, we're able to kind of situate ourselves in the Old Testament. And then lastly, we have Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and 1st and 2nd book of Chronicles. The writings are kind of a loosely grouped book. Some are history, some are poetry, some are prophetic. And so they are more all over the place. So let's go through these. Daniel can kind of fall under Esther. But Daniel spans a larger part of time. And then, okay, so after Babylonians, there's the Persians and the return to Israel. And what happens when they go to Israel? What do?
Rebuild Jerusalem.
Walls.
Okay, what do they do before the walls? The temple, okay? So they rebuild the temple and eventually the walls of Jerusalem, and there's hundreds of years in between that, I think. But we have under the temple Ezra. And under the walls Nehemiah. Okay? And so we've got Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah. Okay, and then there's Chronicles. Okay, Chronicles starts here. And it ends here. So I'm just gonna put Chronicles right here. But Chronicles literally starts with Adam. And it's basically kind of a retelling of the whole history up until the return to the homeland of
Could you read the
Israel.
last few verses of Second Chronicles?
Could I?
I just think it's so poetic.
I would, but I wanna make sure we don't, but it is worth reading, cause it's what the Old Testament ends on, or the
It's
Hebrew
a
Bible.
happy, it's a glorious ending of a movie.
Yeah, it's basically, it's presaging what's to come. Now, it's kind of funny, because you already know, but the way that the Bible's worded, Ezra and Nehemiah happened before Chronicles, but Chronicles ends with this kind of promise of return. Yeah. One of the central incidents of the entire Hebrew Bible is the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem. I can't emphasize this enough. I'll say this over and over again. It's like the complete decimation of their cultural, linguistic, religious, political identity. And not only that, they're taken from their homeland, right? Psalm, is it 137 that talks about, how can we sing these songs in a foreign land? There's just like the emotion of how integral that place was to them, those buildings, to not just them individually, but them communally as a people. And so a lot of the Bible is leading up to this and responding to this. And so when the Hebrew Bible ends, it ends with this message of hope. You're going back home. In many ways, it reminds me a lot of the end of Mark's gospel with the empty tomb. Something's coming, and it's already happened because you're reading this, but it's leaving you on this kind of high note of hope. But also a question of like, what do we do? What's our role? What's our part? But this is a good way to kind of think through all of the Hebrew Bible. So we have Torah, and then we have, well, the Nevi'im start right here. And then the Ketuvim are kind of scattered around. I'll just write Ketuvim here. But that's a really helpful way to think through what's going on here. And what does he start with? What's the book about? What's the Tanakh about? What does Pelikan say?
The law, the covenant.
Well, before even that, what's the very first quote in your handout? The relationship of God with Israel.
God seeking.
From the very beginning to the very end, this is all about God's relationship with Israel. There's politics, there's intrigue, there's ups and downs, but at its core is that message of relationship. And that's obviously what the New Testament is about, right? But I can't stress that enough. I just gave you this like whole historical lineup, right? That's a way to think about it organizationally, but it's not about the history. It's about God's relationship with these people through all these incidents. So we move to the next section, which is the canon of the Hebrew Tanakh. Let me stop. Are there any questions on this before I move ahead? Yes.
Would all writers have had that same philosophy that you have just expressed about it's all about relationships? Oh, we want to stress that?
No.
They just writing about what they thought was important to write about.
No, we have to remember these books are written at parts of time, and Jews, just as Christians, are not monolithic. Even within Scripture, they're not monolithic. You can go to Deuteronomy, and and even in Leviticus, there's like over and over again, welcome the foreigner. There's a part in Leviticus 19:18 where it says, this is where Jesus pulls from. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And then it gets down to verse 30 and it says, you shall love the alien as yourself. Okay? It's radically hospitable. It's radically welcoming. But then you get to Ezra and Nehemiah, and there's these Jewish men that have married women that are not Jewish, and they kick them out and their kids. They literally just get them out of there. That's in complete contradiction of what Deuteronomy ascribes. And what's happening here, though, is a historical reality that they've completely lost any sense or trace of their identity. They've been in a foreign land and they return back, and it's almost like this nationalistic streak, right? We're lost, there's chaos around us, we've been living in a foreign land for so long, we come back, and they almost reactionarily kick out people that are not like them. Okay, that is in complete odds with what's spoken here. That's what the Bible is. It's messy. There's stuff all over there. What we have to do as interpreters is first and foremost look at it through the lens of Christ, right? But second, to take it as a whole. And I think the message as a whole would put the emphasis more on this than that.
Thank you.
On just a human level, can you imagine telling your family just to leave, right? But yes, the Bible is it's polyphonic, right? There's multiple voices throughout, and sometimes they contrast. And like another great example of that is Psalms. There's these high notes where it's like, God, you've called me to care and to love for these people around me. And then there's parts where like, let infants be scattered against the rocks. Like, what do we do with this? What we have to do with that these are humans wrestling with what God's calling them to, and sometimes it's not pretty.
Will?
Yes.
Frequently he uses the term, Pelican uses the term post-biblical,
Yes.
post-biblical era, post-biblical period. Is what he's talking about sort of after the period that's covered by the scriptures? In other words, after, the apostles have done their thing and passed away, and is that what he means, is post-biblical began when the apostles, die off and we're into whatever comes next?
I would assume that's what he's referring to.
Not this chapter.
I would have to look at a specific instance. Do you have an instance of it?
Well, there are a number of them. I'll bring it up later.
Okay, yeah, if you want to look through it and then bring it up at the end of class. That there's various ways to refer to biblical times. There's what's called like the
Intertestament period.
right, which is the intertestament is the period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And the intertestament spans roughly from around when Daniel was written, not when it takes place. But after this and before Christ comes. And what happens during that period is largely like historically, if you've read Maccabees or like the Hasmonean dynasty, it was a group of Jews that were revolting at one point against the Romans. And so you have this biblical period, then you have the intertestamental period, and then you have this very, very short period that the New Testament's written in. So I maybe he's talking about after the New Testament. Okay, let's move to the canon. So on page 45, as even this sketchy outline indicates, the books of the Bible were written one at a time and over a long period of time. The question as to which books belong in the Tanakh is complicated by its history in Judaism and then in Christianity. Not only is the use of the word canon as a designation for an authoritative list of sacred books a rather late phenomenon within the history of the Jewish community, but even the idea of a fixed and final list came about only after a long evolution. This is really important. The Bible did not drop out of the sky. It literally was, and I do not say this lightly, it was miraculously over time kept around and slowly stitched together to become the book we have. But think about how hard it is to keep track of one book. Think about that before the printing press, before even books, when there were scrolls, right? Like it's incredible that these have been transmitted, and like we have the Dead Sea Scrolls and stuff from Qumran, and they largely line up word for word. And there were people literally after Christ that kept the tradition orally and remembered every vowel, because in the Hebrew the vowels are points, they're above and below the letters. and the order of all this stuff, it's incredible that we have what we have today. But that did not happen overnight. It didn't happen over a century, it happened over centuries.
So the scribes that are referred to in the New Testament,
Uh-huh.
are they copying the Hebrew?
They're more like scholars that
Okay.
studied it. Yeah, I mean, some of them are
It's not
copying it.
scriptorium?
I mean, that's happening, but a lot of it is more like, people that would discuss it and argue.
Rabbinic tradition.
Yes, well, it's preceding the rabbinic, the Pharisees precede the rabbinic tradition, but they basically turn into that. Yeah. So, okay, so what we know as the canon is a closed group of books. Okay, that did not happen overnight either. And Pelican, I'm gonna read this, but it's wrong. The safest generalization permitted is this: various collections of sacred writings were put together quite early in the history of Israel, as is evident from such terms as the books, but they did not become a canon until much later. That's all true. The name canon may properly be applied to the books that seem to have been adopted by the assembly of rabbis at Jamnia about 90 or 100 CE under the leadership of Rabbi Akiva. Until then, apparently the status of Song of Songs of Koheleth, which is Ecclesiastes, remained doubtful, but at Jamnia they were definitely included in the canon. Formally, the Jewish canon of the Bible came to include the three divisions of Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, as we have been employing them here. In this canon, however, the Torah has held and holds a special place as a canon within the canon. All that is true except Jamnia. Jamnia is this hypothetical thing that many people pinned down as to when the Hebrew Bible was finally canonized as a whole. But scholars have come to believe that that is bogus, not a real thing. And so you go to this handout I keep referring to you on the other side, not the graph. You'll see in the center of the page, the three-part canonization process. So what happens is the canon is being, it's becoming canonical in sections and not all at once. And so the Torah was definitively canonized around 400 BC. But I've got this date 621 in this reference to 2 Kings. Does anyone know what that is? Any Bible scholars want to take a stab?
They, covered what they believe was Deuteronomy and.
Yes. Yes, so they find the law, the writings of the law, under Josiah. So Josiah is one of the good kings, and you have to remember, we think of Jews as people that kept the law and lived that faith out, you know, day in, day out. But they largely fluctuated in between keeping the law and going away from the law. And so what happens is they fluctuated away from the law under a greedy king, and then Josiah comes in and they find this in the temple walls, the law, which most people believe is an earlier form of Deuteronomy. Not Deuteronomy as we have it, but an earlier form, right? It's Moses giving the law. And they're like, holy crap, what have we been doing? And so Josiah has a religious reform based off of that. And so that is when the Torah kind of becomes a central document, but it's not until 400 that group of 5 writings, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, becomes a central kind of book of its own. After that, the Nevi'im, the prophets, they're around, but they do not become kind of canonized until 200. And then finally, around 90, although it could be later, the Ketuvim, the writings, right, this kind of miscellaneous group gets canonized. And I write here close canon under that. So I mentioned the Hasmonean dynasty. This is a group of Jews. The Jews are under oppression from Assyria all the way into the time of Christ under Rome, right? They never had their own nation. They're always living under someone else after.
Where do the Greeks come in?
The Greeks?
Yeah, Alexander.
The Greeks come in around here, and then the Romans.
Right.
Yeah, so you can think about it this way. The Jews are in Israel under Assyrian oppression, and then under Judah, Babylonian oppression, and then Persian, and then Greeks, and then the Greeks split up after Alexander into the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. It breaks up into kind of a confederacy of powers. Alexander is distributed, and then the Romans. But you have to think about that. Imagine living in a country for centuries, or in a, in a land for centuries under foreign rule and domination. And so this group of Jews under a group called, people called Maccabees, they say enough of this, and they fight against the Greeks and eventually against the Romans. During that period, there's these books written that are historical called the Maccabees, and they talk about the books there. And then Prologue to Sirach is another apocryphal text. It's not included in our Bible, but it is a kind of biblical text. But the thing that really brings a close to the Bible, so remember, it happens in stages, canonized, but they're not considered an entire document until the Christians come around. Because the Christians are originally just a Jewish sect, but they eventually start to split into their own religious movement. And as that happens, the Jews say, hey, they're trying to claim our scriptures. And so that kind of makes a practical reason to close the canon. And there's this thing called Baba Batra. That is a part of the Talmud, which is a group of rabbinic writings. Have y'all ever heard the word Talmud?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so the Talmud, there's two Talmuds around this period, and that's when most scholars would say the canon gets definitively closed in those Talmuds. And they cannot precisely date them, but they date them to around the rise of Christianity in 70 to 200 AD. I put 90 because most people think it was around 90 or 100, but that's when we can say that the Hebrew Bible was closed. That doesn't mean there wasn't a Hebrew Bible before that, but that means when it was canonized, when it was closed.
So the Babylonian Talmud is an Alexandrian Talmud.
Yes.
And then there was commentary on commentary. That kind of like the Midrash?
Yeah, that's within it all, yeah. There's all kinds of different sections in there. The Babylonian Talmud is the one that Baba Batra is in, where they think that it was finally closed. But in our book, Jamnia is no longer believed to be a thing.
What are the dates of the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Oh, I don't know. I think they're intertestamental though.
I mean, when they were actually written down.
Yeah, I think they're intertestamental period.
I think that, yeah.
I would have to look that up. I don't know for sure. I'm assuming just based off of what I know about them that they were in that period, which would have been like 200 BC. And but I think some of them are more contemporary.
But there was
That's one of the essays.
a Gospel of Thomas and a Gospel of Philip, so that related to Christian era. They were among the Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a ton of different writings in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and a lot of the stuff we talk about is helping validate a lot of the dating on these writings, or books that we would consider Old Testament or Tanakh. Okay, going back to our handout, we're gonna move to chapter 3 now. So chapter 3 is, let's keep this up, and the Bible doesn't really talk about, or I shouldn't say the Bible, the Tanakh doesn't really talk about this, but we have the Greeks, right, and then Romans. And if you're history buffs, you know that Alexander, any history buffs, how long was Alexander in power?
35 years.
Yeah, it was relatively short, but
Power.
incredible how much power.
How old he was when he died.
Yeah, so
About 15.
when Alexander dies, his kingdom splits into these different factions, and then the Romans. But what's really important for our sake is that, they've come back and Ezra and Nehemiah have happened, and now the Greeks are in power. What happens during this is not only this incredible spread of the Greek world, but Greek culture. That's what we call Hellenization. And along with it comes the spread of Greek language. And so what happens is a lot of this world starts to speak Greek. And so that kind of leads us into our chapter, our next chapter. But by the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, to the regret of many, this category of anyone who did not know Hebrew had come to include increasing numbers of people, especially in the younger generation, who by heritage and tradition professed the faith of Israel, and who in some measure wanted to go on practicing it. Painstaking counting by modern scholars has shown that there were Jews dispersed throughout most of the Greco-Roman world, a phenomenon that has acquired the name the dispersion, or in Greek, diaspora. So for Jewish people, especially after the Babylonian captivity, writing and being able, I mean, even to this day, right? Bat and bar mitzvahs, right? It's an essential part to know how to speak and read Hebrew. And it was so integral to their communities that their literary rate was like magnitudes of order higher than any community surrounding them, because they put such a precedent on people learning to not only speak that language, but to read it. But as things do, things shift. And as Hellenization happens, right, with the Greeks, the people speaking Hebrew lessens more and more and more until it's like a rare thing among even among Jews. Now, it still remained the language of worship, and obviously when they're reading and chanting in their synagogues, but the people, just kind of like lay people speaking it, decreased. So another thing that's happening is in what's called the ancient Near East, or what we would call like the Holy Land or the Middle East. They're starting to speak Aramaic, which is kind of like a cousin tongue of Hebrew. So while Hellenization is happening, Greek is being spread, but we can also put Aramaic here. This is probably what everyone that we read in the New Testament was speaking. Jesus, Paul, right? They probably were all speaking Aramaic, which is which is like a relative of Hebrew, but it's not Hebrew, right? And so the capacity of Jews to read their scriptures was lessening. And so he takes us to Alexandria. By far the most important of the Jewish colonies, this is part of the diaspora, was in Alexandria, Egypt. As its name suggests, the city of Alexandria had been founded by Alexander the Great in 332 BCE. Those two factors in the situation of Jewish Alexandria, the eternal need to guarantee continuity of Jewish worship, teaching, and observance, despite the continuing cultural and linguistic change, and the external need to formulate an apologetic for Judaism that would be addressed to its culture despisers as a much later apologetic would define the target audience, were responsible not only for a substantial body of Jewish philosophical theology in Greek, but also the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, which is usually called the Septuagint. Okay, so what he's describing here is in the Jewish world, right? They're spread out, okay? They're not all in one area. And one of the largest epicenters of Jewish life at this point in time is Alexandria in Egypt. And Alexandria is a very, very cultured city, right? There's Jews, there's Gentiles, there's Christians all living together. There's that really big library that's so famous. And so what's happening is, in that intellectual current, the Jews say, they're a very, very small number compared to Christians or Gentiles, right? They say, well, we need to kind of share our works because no one else can read them. They're in Hebrew. And not only that, some of our people can't read them. So they create this text called the Septuagint. And I'll just flip it.
That was prior to Christ.
The Septuagint?
Yeah,
Yes.
so they weren't Christians though.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm kind of jumping around. I'm not very historically thoughtful, am I? Okay, so preceding Christians, there's all these different groups. There's like Greeks and Jews and all these other people, but they're all having all these philosophical conversations, right? Like you think about like Platonism and Stoics and Epicureans, right? So people are very largely associated with these schools of philosophy. and the Jews are interacting with them. And the Jews are trying to kind of bring their little tiny sect of a religion. Like, the Jews are such a small people throughout history. It's a really incredible story about how the impact they've had on culture. But what they do is they translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek, okay? And they do it for two reasons. I would say the primary is internal.
Internal use.
Yes, that is for Greek-speaking Jews that can't access their scriptures. The second reason is external. And that is so that all these philosophers, specifically in Alexandria, and interested parties that they're interacting with, can have access to their scriptures. Because there are not people just learning Hebrew for the sake of learning Hebrew at this point in time. So this is why the Septuagint is written, okay? So the Septuagint, much like the Bible, was probably not translated all at once, but was probably translated in sections, starting with the Torah. Now, one of the things that he brings up is the story behind what's known. Another way that people refer to the Septuagint is the 7, LXX. And this is a story that Alexander got 6 people from each of the tribes to translate the entire Hebrew Bible into Greek. And so all these scholars, 72 of them, went out and they wrote it down. And when they brought it together, every single word was the exact same for the entire thing. And so they were like, well, this has to be a divine error. That did not happen. It's a neat story though, right? And people still to this day refer to it as the 70s, the LXX. Now, were people translating it? Yes. Were they sharing it? Yes. Did that document eventually become the Septuagint? Yes. But it wasn't nice, neat, and orderly like that. But those stories are better than the historical stories, right? So that's just another way you'll hear it referred to is the LXX. And that's the story behind it. So let's jump down to go to page 57, because I think this is a really important part in the book.
So
Five.
that's not in your handout.
5, 7.
Yeah. We're gonna actually use our books.
5, 7.
5, 7. And I'm reading from that bottom paragraph. About 6 lines down. It is important to note, but not to exaggerate, some of the adaptations of the biblical text to a non-Jewish audience, as when the Hebrew phrase, the hand of God, is translated into Greek as the power of God, to avoid the impression that the divine was like a human being, as this impression had been propagated through the anthropomorphism of the mythological Olympian deities. More fundamentally, the enterprise of producing the Septuagint, like any translation of any text, especially a sacred text in any period of history, was based on the rather audacious assumption that there were really Greek equivalents for all the original Hebrew words, not only for all those species of animals, birds, and reptiles that were listed in the catalogs of the book of Leviticus as unclean, but above all for the one true God, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, and for everything the biblical writers had confessed about the words, actions, and attributes of the one true God. Although it did employ the Greek word theos, which had come out of the polytheistic mythology of Mount Olympus, and which was generally used by most Greek writers in the plural, to express the primal confession of the monotheistic faith of Israel, the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone, it did not try to adapt the names of individual Olympian deities to its monotheistic purposes. Such translations would have entailed a complicity in the heathen idolatry of the Homeric gods and demigods. This is just really, really important. When you're translating, you're not just translating a language, you're translating a culture. When Jews read the hand of God, They knew that that was a metaphor, right? They didn't think that God had hands. But Greeks, who had anthropomorphic gods who lived on Mount Olympus, thought they were literally human. And so the writers of the Septuagint, when they're translating the Hebrew to Greek, they're having to keep in mind, almost like, hey, these dumb Greeks think gods have hands. So we can't say the hand of God. We have to say the power of God. So this is happening all over. The translation's happening. It's so, so important for us. And we're going to talk about this when we get to the Protestant Reformation. But it's so, so important to be able to read the original text and also to know the mindset, right? The ideology, the culture of that people. Because that's a very simple idea, but you can see how that would happen over and over again as they're translating.
But the example you just cited, translating the hand of God to the power of God is respectful of the Hebrew meaning. Right?
Yeah, but it's not
That doesn't confuse the.
but it's not a translation.
Right.
But isn't that where we start to get problems? I mean, you're translating Hebrew into Greek, and you know, even the best translation of something to something else is never literal.
Yes, I think this is really, really important for us to think about, and I do not think that there's like a solid answer to this, other than that translation is complicated and it is never word for word. Even when you're doing your best to do word for word, culture, beliefs are seeping into that. The King James Bible has a different theology just because of its place and time than the New Revised Standard Version does because of its place and time. We are human, we are embodied beings, and we exist in time and places, and that seeps into our language and the way we understand language. And so when you look at translations, they are literally they are super, super complicated, and it's never as simple as, oh, they're just, you know, exchanging a word for a word.
And sort of an inevitable consequence is that certain Greek concepts that were not Jewish concepts end up creeping into these holy texts.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole history of Christians trying to reconcile the embodiedness of Judaism and the kind of intellectual abstractness of Greek philosophy, and thinking about how both of those have influenced how we understand Christianity. There's tons of texts that compare what they would say Alexandria, Greek culture, to Jerusalem. And that's largely this tug and pull between how we as Christians understand our religion. Do we understand it as Jewish, or do we understand it more as coming out of a Greek world? And there's been tons of debate and dialogue on that concept.
All the Neoplatonists.
Yeah, yes, I mean, like, all of these questions come up, but I think the point that's important for us to remember is that when we are translating, and the Septuagint is like one of the first times our Bible is translated into another language, right? The Hebrew Bible. This translation begins a domino effect of misunderstandings, mistranslations, misinterpretations. And some of those we have in this room, okay? Like, we're a product of this. And so that's, the church has struggled with that. And another thing to really, really think about is that where do we draw the line, right? Do we just get down to the granular details and say, well, if we don't understand this word, then our faith isn't true? Or do we say something larger than that, that God is about a relationship, and that these inform us, but these aren't what our faith is based upon? But it's really, really important to just to acknowledge the complicatedness of all of this. So another example of that complicatedness is page 59 in your book. So at the very top, William, would you just read? It's a lot to read, but would you just read that top section on page 59?
Sure, starting at the cause.
Yes.
Because the Greek word for a messenger of any kind was angelos, and the word for wind could also mean spirit. The sense in the psalm, he makes his ends his messengers. Comes out in the Greek translation as he makes his angels spirits. It is quoted that way in the New Testament as part of a discussion of the angels, as well as in Christian liturgies to this day.
even though that is not what the Hebrew original is saying. Where the Hebrew has, look, the young woman is with child and about to give birth to a son, let her name him Emmanuel, without specifying the status of the young woman any more precisely. Septuagint uses the words Parthenos, virgin, which the gospel quotes in Greek with the formula, all this happened in order to fulfill what the Lord declared through the prophet, for the virginal conception of Mary, of Jesus from his mother Mary. Later in the book of Isaiah, the Septuagint, and I saw two mounted horsemen and a rider on an ass, and a rider on a camel, became an embarrassment to Christian apologists, but a welcome support to Muslim disputes, because it seemed to be prophesying not only that Jesus would enter into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday riding on a donkey, as the Christian gospel described him doing in the New Testament, but he would be followed, almost exactly 6 centuries later, by the prophet Muhammad, who was a camel driver.
So our New Testament, by and large, when it's quoting from the Hebrew Bible, is quoting from what text? The Septuagint, okay? So it's translating from a translation of the original. And so we get things like the virgin from Isaiah being used to kind of justify that text is prophesying that Mary would be a virgin and give birth to Christ. I can't stress enough. It's really important to be aware of this, but do not let your faith hang on these things, right? Our faith is much bigger than specific words. And I think it's part of the messiness of being a human that this is how traditions come to us. They do not come to us in a vacuum, sealed from any dust, right? There's tons of dust and mud and dirt in our tradition. It's good to be aware of it, but you're just going to drive yourself crazy trying to figure it all out or be able to defend every single instance of it. I taught a class one time. We have a really close relationship with a Reformed synagogue near us. And there was a rabbi there named Rabbi Bernholtz, and we studied Isaiah as a group, right? We had like 150 people from the synagogue in our church studying Isaiah together. And he would always say, I don't know why people get hung up on this. You want to say this is talking about Jesus? Fine. I want to say it's not. Fine. It doesn't matter. This is my tradition. That's your tradition. And we are big enough to share a tradition that devolves from each other around a singular text. His point being is like, the text is bigger than a singular interpretation. It always is, right? And so, you know, as Christians, we might associate with one way, and as Jews, they might associate with the other, but we have these shared texts, and there are multiple ways of interpreting it. I do think, though, it behooves us to be aware of these things and not to dismiss them, but I do think we don't want to hang our faith on all these things, because you'll literally drive yourself crazy. I taught a Bible study, and there was this guy in there, and he was crazy about the Hebrew Bible, specifically the Torah and the documents around the Ark. And he'd always talk about it. And the head pastor at my church, who'd been there a lot longer than me, goes, that guy has an Ark. He drives around in his trailer. And it's to precise measurements. And I'm like, what? I thought he was pulling my leg. And the guy was kind of weird, so he just kind of come and go. And I'm not lying, one day the guy shows up and all he could talk about was the Ark. Like, that guy did not care about Jesus. He just cared about the Ark. And he goes, I brought the Ark. And I thought it was going to be like this little miniature. And he walks me out, and he has this giant trailer on the back of his truck, and he opens it up, and there's a life-size gold-plated Ark that this guy was just driving around South Tampa. Like, that's what happens when you get too into the details, right? That guy lost the point. It was really interesting and made a good story, but I don't think that's what Jesus wants. But all that to say, the Septuagint begins the problem of interpretation, not only within Judaism, but also as Greeks start to read it and understand it, and then eventually Christians. And so that brings us. So let's go back to the handout to page 60. From an obscure sect turned inward, huddled around its Torah and reciting a Shema, Judaism had now become a world religion, significant force in the civilization of the Mediterranean world. from the northernmost palm tree to the northernmost olive tree, as the Mediterranean world is defined in Ferdinand Bradel's delightful formula. And nothing had contributed as much to this transformation of the Jewish faith into a world religion as had the Septuagint. Whether or not the story was historically true, that it had actually been produced through the divine inspiration of those 72 bilingual scribes in Alexandria. So the Septuagint is doing a ton of things, good and bad. One of them is Judaism kind of steps out of the shadow and becomes what Pelikan's referring to as a world religion. It's a religion that people are familiar with outside of just that group of people that believe or adhere to it. I'm going to jump over this part about Moses, but this just ties into that. As Judaism becomes a more popular, more well-known religion, you're starting to see it spread out just beyond the scriptures. And part of that was that Moses became this kind of like heroic figure. So you have to think about, like, he references Plutarch, right? And Plutarch has all his different heroes that he compares the Greek and the Roman ones. Well, at the same time, Josephus and Philo of Alexandria are writing these kind of histories of Jewish people and histories of Moses. And those are spreading beyond just Jewish people. And so what's happening is there's like a cultural cachet to Judaism that wasn't there before the Septuagint.
And Moses is presented in more universal terms, Greco-Roman terms and ideals.
Yes.
Courage, patience, they're.
Yes. I mean, like what happens throughout history over and over again is things are understood in the context with which they're being spoken about. And the context that Josephus and Philo are writing in are largely Greco-Roman. They're very like philosophically oriented, focusing on virtues and personal development. And so they situate Moses within that. Now they tell Moses his history, but they dress it up in that kind of Greco-Roman clothing. So all that to say that Judaism is spreading. It's not just Jews that know about Judaism now. So now we come to the Christian significance of the Septuagint. In many ways, the principal legatee of the Jewish Septuagint was not Judaism, but Christianity. At least some of the writers of the New Testament were in a position to correct the translations of the Septuagint on the basis of their knowledge of Hebrew Bible, but apart from them, knowledge of the original Hebrew virtually disappeared from the church for 1,000 years or more. So we have, like, we'll just say like 70 AD, right? This is when Christianity is really becoming a thing, right? Paul's already been around. The Gospels are starting to come out. Remember, just like the Old Testament stories, the Gospels were originally told orally. And they wouldn't write them down because they considered them too holy. But as the generations passed, they said, we need to capture this, just like the Babylonian destruction had preceded the transition. So what's happening here is the Christians are creating their own scriptures, and they're also utilizing the Jewish scriptures. Because remember, they're a Jewish sect at first. As this period goes, the amount of Jewish Christians minimizes more and more until it's a largely Gentile religion. And so the people that know Hebrew at this point in time are basically just two people, Origen and Jerome. That's it. Until right before the Reformation. So with the humanist movement, like Erasmus is a good example of that. That's when you start to see people saying, we need to go, there's this term called ad fontes. We need to go back to the sources. And that's when Christian scholars start learning Hebrew again. But basically, it's just Origen to Jerome, literally. And so the Septuagint is the main text. And so
were any Hebrew text available for them to look behind the Septuagint?
what do you mean?
Jerome in translating the Vulgate, did he rely only on the Septuagint, or did he look at?
Oh, he could read Hebrew.
Earlier Hebrew sources.
They both read Hebrew, and so they could look at the original sources. but they largely used the Septuagint.
And there weren't that many original sources.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. Yeah, it depends where you were in the world and stuff like that, who you were friends with too. So I wanna read, well, Margaret, would you read the quote from 6465?
The Septuagint was, according to a Greek Orthodox confession of faith written in the 19th century, a true and perfect version of the Hebrew text. Whether they are sung in Greek, Slavonic, or Arabic, or now in English, the Psalms, which are the foundation of the Eastern Orthodox liturgy, continue to be based on the Psalter of the Septuagint or on translations from the Septuagint rather than from the Hebrew. In the West, too, even the earliest Latin translations of the books of the Tanakh, which we have now only in fragments, were based on it, being therefore translations of a translation, in which the human mistakes or idiosyncrasies of the 70, or whoever they were compounded rather than corrected, as the words of the Bible made their tortuous way across the several major linguistic boundaries from Hebrew to Greek to Latin.
Okay, so in the Orthodox Church, which you'll know about like Russian Orthodox or Greek Orthodox, there's other variations of it. But what they're doing is they to this day still use the Septuagint. Now, Catholics and Protestants have shifted, but the point being is that Hebrew was translated into Greek as the Septuagint, and then from there, it went into Latin and other languages. And there was a large period preceding the Reformation mostly, where that would be translated into German or French. And sometimes it would be like this would be translated to French. So look, 1, 2, 3, 4. Most of them after Latin were 4 when they were put into the contemporary tongue, which is much later. But even the Latin is 3 removes from the original, or 2. And then as they get into like the vulgar, right, the common tongues, they start translating translations of translations. And it's really not, and we'll talk about this, but it's really not until the Reformation that biblical scholars go back and learn Hebrew and learn Greek, so that they're not doing translations of translations of translations. Now, we just looked at some quick examples, but already you're seeing theological differences because of the way the language has changed. Think about all the issues that arise when you change from here. Pelican refers to the telephone game, right? You whisper something to someone and they tell someone, when it goes down, it's like that, but with an entire, 39 books, essentially. So this is just something to be mindful of. We'll return to it when we talk about the New Testament, and specifically the translators preceding and during the Reformation. But to close, one of the things that Pelican says is the Jews that originally translated this did it in this way that they thought would have a positive outcome, but in many ways it was a negative outcome for them, because the Septuagint was used as an apologetic against Jews by Christians. So Jews and Christians have obviously had a very a rocky relationship through history, and oftentimes Christian communities would say, oh, no, your own texts talk about Jesus, and would use that to exclude them or for even more violent purposes. And so a lot of Jews came to resent that there was even translated. And then that last quote, page 66, the Septuagint should not be the only place to look for the meaning of a word in the Gospels or in St. Paul, but it definitely must be the first place to look. So we've kind of hinted at this before, but just remember, when you're reading your New Testament, a lot of those translations are not coming from the Hebrew original, but rather from the Greek Septuagint. And that can bring a different word than was originally included, or even different meaning than was originally included in the Hebrew Bible. And then lastly, if you go in your book to page 66, he's given some kind of negative examples of translation. but I think this is a more positive one, right? And so when we think of logos, we think of it in a kind of Greek sense, right? Of rationality, of logic. But he says, if you look to the Septuagint, you can see it points more towards wisdom, and this wisdom that is a kind of co-creative force with God. So up toward the top of the page, 4 lines down, the John 1, the prelude or prologue. In the beginning, the Word already was. The Word was in God's presence, and what God was, the Word was. He was with God at the beginning, and through him all things came to be. Without him, no things came into being. But then, if you look at the Septuagint and go down to Proverbs 8, the 8th chapter, which is almost toward the bottom of the page, about 4 lines up. The Lord made me the beginning of his ways for his works. He established me before time was in the beginning. Oops, I just lost myself. Before he made the earth. When he prepared the heaven, I was present with him. I was by him, suiting myself to him. I was that in which he took delight, and daily I rejoiced in his presence continually. So while the Septuagint can often be a misunderstanding, it can also be a helpful understanding of what John was driving at, right? John is situated within a Jewish tradition that would be leaning more toward an understanding of Sophia as wisdom, as talked about in Proverbs 8, and not just logos as like the Platonic philosophers would have understood it as this kind of abstract logic or understanding.
So amazing going. I've read this chapter, preparing for today, and attention was drawn to Proverbs 8. And then for the Wednesday Bible study, men's Bible study group, we use the common lectionary. And this week, the reading for this coming Sunday, Proverbs 8.
You know why? Because it's Trinity Sunday.
It's what?
Trinity Sunday. So Sophia.
Proverbs 8 is wisdom speaking.
Yes, so that the wisdom tradition is often listed up as the Holy Spirit, or as Christ's Spirit, which, you know, Christ is the Holy Spirit, is God, right? By the way, I'm teaching a class on the Trinity and Covenant this week.
You are?
Yes, because it's Trinity Sunday. Any other questions before we close? This is a lot to take in.
I actually had a question.
A lot of this is going to repeat as we go through the book. I've read this book before, multiple times. It is a wonderful, wonderful history and overview of the Bible and how it came to be together. And it's a beautiful, beautiful story. And I think it makes our own understanding of Scripture so much more meaningful. But if you're feeling like this is a lot to take in, just remember that we are going to go through this stuff over and over again. Next week, we'll read chapter 4 and 5. Thank y'all.
Will.
It's not a performance.
Will, this is Trish, online. I had a question.
Yeah.
That one?
Yes.
You need the other one?
About that.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.